If the fantasy genre were a continent, it would be the largest in the world of fiction. There are so many unique subgenres, and fantasy readers have some great choices. That's good for writers, but it also comes with some pitfalls if you don't understand what readers expect. In this video, I'm going to explore the subgenres of fantasy and talk about the tropes and elements that make them distinct. If you're a fantasy writer, this video will help you satisfy your readers and stand out in today's crowded marketplace. What's up, guys? My name is Michael Aran with Author Level Up, helping you write world-class stories better and faster. I create these writing videos because I believe that each of you has Brandon Sanderson level talent, and you just need help unlocking it. If you're new here, consider subscribing and click that little bell to get helpful writing videos every week. And in this writing video, we're talking about the subgenres of fantasy. I've been writing fantasy for the last 5 years, and I've published over a dozen novels in the genre. So while I have a lot to learn, I'm also an avid reader and student. Think of this video as a master class in the genre. This won't be an exhaustive list by any means, but I've done my best to cover the biggest genres that every working fantasy writer needs to know about. But first, what is fantasy? My working definition of fantasy is that it's a genre where magic is the heart of the story, in a fantastical world with fantastical characters. That's not always the case, but that's our working definition for this video. It's sometimes, but not always, good versus evil, and more often than not, good triumphs over evil. So let's jump into our list. Arthurian fantasy is named after King Arthur and his lot. You've no doubt heard of Lancelot, Guinevere, Merlin, and the Knights of the Round Table. Arthurian fantasy generally takes place during the time of King Arthur and usually features stories of Arthurian characters told in new and imaginative ways. Iconic books in the genre go as far back as Le Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory. I know I pronounced that wrong. And Sir Gawain and the Green Knight are both common books that are assigned in high school and college classes. More recently, The Once and Future King is considered by many to be the quintessential Arthurian fantasy, chronicling the life of King Arthur and the romance of Lancelot and Guinevere. This one book is responsible for making the genre what it is today. In pop culture, Arthurian influences abound, from Disney's The Sword and the Stone, which is a retelling of The Once and Future King, to Monty Python and the Holy Grail, considered by some to be one of the greatest, funniest films of all time. Despite taking place in a time long ago, Arthurian fantasy endures, and writers are always finding ways to make it new and relevant, mixing it with other genres to create something fresh and original. High fantasy is fantasy that takes place in a fictional world, as opposed to low fantasy, which takes place in a world or a world similar to Earth. The Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson is a great example of high fantasy, where you have a fictional world and a complex magic system that plays a major role in the plot. The quest trope is also an important part of the genre. And another element that defines high fantasy is the good versus evil trope. Readers expect the good guys to win. Fantasy is perhaps known as the genre where the good guys always win, and if they don't, then you may have what's called a dark fantasy, but more on that later. High fantasy usually includes a fantastical world with a rich mythology and history, with many fictional races such as elves, orcs, goblins, dragons, and a host of magical relics and artifacts. It often also includes beautiful, imaginative locales, and maps are an important mainstay in the genre. If you're writing serious fantasy, then your book better have a map at the beginning of it. Readers have come to expect that, and they want to understand the geography of the worlds that they visit. High fantasy is sometimes used interchangeably with epic fantasy. An epic fantasy may be a better description if the series has a bigger scope. Epic fantasy can be summed up with two examples: The Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. Alright, I guess we're done here, folks. See ya! But seriously, Tolkien pretty much defined this genre, and George R.R. Martin reinvented it. When most people think of fantasy, they think of a Lord of the Rings or a Lord of the Rings type world. Epic fantasy is perhaps the most decadent of the fantasy genres, and writers of this genre wrote the book on world building. There's a chess-like component to the plot, with many subplots interweaving and intermingling in interesting and unique ways that keeps readers guessing. You should also expect lots of mythology, a hard magic system, and a long narrative. Epic fantasies are jokingly referred to as doorstop fantasy novels for a reason. Some of these books could be murder weapons. Other prominent examples of epic fantasy include the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan, the King Killer series by Patrick Rothfuss, and the Inheritance trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. In pop culture, the Lord of the Rings movies and a Game of Thrones TV series are perhaps the best examples of epic fantasy adapted for casual fans of the genre. Because this genre is so intricate and involved, you don't often see too many examples of books being adapted for the big screen, but it remains one of the most popular fantasy genres because readers can get lost in the worlds and stories, which, in my opinion, is what true fantasy is all about. Dark fantasy is fantasy mixed with horror, usually with a dark and gritty tone. Every good dark fantasy has an anti-hero at the center of the story, usually someone with a broken moral compass. The genre is known for having a high level of violence and mature content that would make most audiences shudder. An early iconic dark fantasy series is the Elric saga by Michael Moorcock. Elric is an albino sorcerer who engages in a lot of magic, drug use, death, and darkness. The series is super dark, and some also consider this to be a sword and sorcery series as well. A great recent example of dark fantasy is Prince of Thorns by Mark Lawrence, which is a vengeance tale about a prince reclaiming his throne after watching his family get slaughtered in front of his very eyes. This book is not for the faint of heart, and I had a hard time reading it, honestly. And for a shameless plug, my Last Dragon Lord series centers on an evil dragon lord, Old Dark. The series chronicles his fall from power and his bloodthirsty quest for vengeance against the dragons who betrayed him. For dark fantasy and pop culture, look no further than Game of Thrones. While the famous series by George R. R. Martin is technically a mix between epic fantasy and a few other subgenres, dark fantasy is an accurate description. Historical fantasy takes place in our world in a time of the past, with real-life historical events being central to the story. It could be ancient Egypt, or Greece, or London during World War I. There's no limit to the author's imagination. More often than not, it takes place in an alternate world where the historical timeline is slightly different, like the Nazis winning World War II, for example, or if the Aztecs drove out the conquistadors, or the fantastical elements could appear behind the scenes of the real world, hidden from most people. For some great examples of historical fantasy, check out the Temeraire series by Naomi Novik, which is a reimagination of the Napoleonic Wars with an air force of dragons. On Stranger Tides by Tim Powers follows a puppeteer trying to seek revenge against his uncle, who gets wrapped up with pirates, Blackbeard, and all kinds of other pirate lore rooted in history. Now, my absolute favorite example of historical fantasy or alternate fantasy is a cult classic video game called Shadowheart's Covenant. It follows a lieutenant in the German army in World War I as she specializes in exorcism, and it also follows a half-human, half-demon as the two become unlikely allies in a quest to stop the bastard son of Tsar Nicholas II from taking over the world with an army of demons. Anastasia Romanoff is a playable character, and even Rasputin himself is a villain in the story. It's just a fantastic game with a fantastic story with great historical details that take place in World War I Europe and Japan. Military fantasy is fantasy that heavily involves a military or armed force of some kind, with the hero usually serving as a soldier. This could be serving in a dragon air force, like in Naomi Novik's Temeraire series, or a soldier in a fictional army embroiled in war, like in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series by Stephen Erickson, or another type of conflict. Military fantasy, like its cousin, military science fiction, is extremely versatile and anything goes, as long as there is a military and military procedure. That has to be central to the plot, real or fictional. Mythic fantasy is fantasy that involves characters from mythology, usually famed gods and creatures from folklore. It draws from common philosophies, tropes, and stories from mythology. American Gods and Anansi Boys by Neil Gaiman is the quintessential mythic fantasy series. Gods from mythology live hidden among humanity, trying to stay alive and relevant. The Percy Jackson series by Rick Riordan is another solid example of mythic fantasy, because, after all, Percy Jackson is the son of Poseidon. Iconic examples of mythic fantasy in pop culture would be the Thor movies. Yes, they're based on a comic, and yes, it's primarily a superhero, but the Thor storyline embodies mythic fantasy at its best. Plus, I've been using American Gods a lot on my channel and needed a different example. Portal fantasy is not so much a subgenre of fantasy as it is a flavor. It involves the hero jumping from our world into another realm where everything is wondrous, fantastical, and at stake. The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis is perhaps the perfect example of a portal fantasy, but you could just as easily call it high fantasy too. The Dark Tower series by Stephen King is another good example of portal fantasy, though it has elements of a western too. Portal fantasy is so ingrained in our culture that we don't even think about it. It's common in so many genres of books, movies, and television. For example, I'm going to give you the most famous example of all time of portal fantasy. You know it, every child knows it, and it has been a pop culture phenomenon for almost 100 years. Figured it out yet? It's The Wizard of Oz, of course. And we could also talk about Alice in Wonderland, Final Fantasy X, Jak and Daxter for PlayStation, or the animated TV series Gargoyles. There are so many more examples of portal fantasy that you would instantly know if I told them to you. Portal fantasy is also a common trope that is widely used in television shows. That's why I say that it's more of a flavor of fantasy rather than a subgenre, but its importance in the genre cannot be understated. Science fantasy is the illegitimate child of science fiction and fantasy. Generally, it's about as close to science fiction as fantasy can get, and as close to fantasy as science fiction can get. In this genre, you're bound to see science, scientific explanations of why and how things like magic can exist in a fantastical world. You're also bound to see a rational explanation of why things like dragons, unicorns, or vampires exist. Much like historical fantasy, science fantasy can encompass any and all settings. Prominent examples include A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle and anything by Jules Verne, particularly 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. One could argue that Frank Herbert's Dune is also science fantasy. There's also a growing trend of space fantasy among indie authors. For example, Chris Fox's Magitech Chronicles series is an intriguing blend of magic and technology in space. Glenn Stewart's Starship's Mage series is space fantasy that blends light-speed travel, physics, and magic. Steampunk is one of the more niche fantasy genres with a lot of devoted fans. It usually takes place in an alternate world where steam power remained the key source of technology. There is usually fantastical technology like airships, unique inventions, and weapons. And who doesn't love steampunk costumes? Great steampunk series include the Mortal Engine series, where cities are moving vehicles and must consume one another in order to survive in a post-apocalyptic world. It's considered by many to be a great starting point in the genre. For a novel that helped shape steampunk into what it is today, there's Infernal Devices by K.W. Jeter, which has a heavy dose of Victorian culture and elements and mechanical technology. For a more recent entry into the steampunk genre, Lindsay Broker's Emperor's Edge series is a solid entry in the genre. And I should note that steampunk can also be science fiction too, especially if there's more of an emphasis on the plausibility of the technology. Steampunk abounds in popular culture in movies like Wild Wild West, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and many more different examples. But there are so many that I just can't go into all of them in this video. Honestly, steampunk deserves its own video, because I can't do it justice here. Superhero fantasy is exactly what it sounds like. Fantasy with superheroes. Much like in comics, there is an explanation of why superpowers exist, such as a virus or technology, but it need not be scientifically accurate. Brandon Sanderson's STEELHEART series is a good example. When a strange object orbits the Earth and emits radiation that turns certain people into epics with superpowers, a battle between good and evil occurs, with the hero joining the resistance to topple the series' supervillain Steelheart, who has turned everything to steel and hidden the sun from the world. In pop culture, every superhero comic book ever meets the definition of superhero fantasy. Peter Parker is bitten by a radioactive spider, Superman has super strength, and the Black Panther wears a suit made from vibranium and has a connection with the gods. There's some science here, but it's not necessarily plausible. What matters is the superpower, how the character wields it, and how it changes the hero. Sword and sorcery is another classic fantasy subgenre where the hero is a sword-wielding, usually dude, on a personal quest, usually to defeat a bad guy. Unlike epic fantasy, where the scope is very wide, sword and sorcery often focuses on a single protagonist, who usually has some sort of flaw. Classic sword and sorcery would include Conan the Barbarian series by Robert Howard, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser series by Fritz Leiber, and the John Carter series by Edgar Rice Burroughs. A great twist in the genre is the Imaro series by Charles Saunders, which follows an African hero instead of a European one. Out of all the genres in this video, sword and sorcery seems to be out of vogue, as there doesn't seem to be too many sword and sorcery titles in the bestseller lists in an era where urban fantasy and epic fantasy are king. But it has a solid following, and its mark on the fantasy genre is undeniable. Urban fantasy is fantasy that takes place in an urban setting, with magic and mythical creatures. Vampires, demons, and other creatures such as pixies and elves live in the city among humanity. Magic exists, and it exists in the seedy underbelly of the city, or it's just a commonly accepted fact in the city. The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher follows a wizard named Harry Dresden who solves murders in the city of Chicago. The Mercy Thompson series by Patricia Briggs features a shifter coyote living among a pack of wolves, working as an auto mechanic by day. For a great indie example, the 20-sided Sorceress series by Annie Belay features a sorceress who owns a comic and board game shop who gets embroiled in dangerous encounters with vampires and sorcerers. Urban fantasy is a juggernaut in the fantasy genre, and I did a separate video on it. Check it out by clicking the YouTube card above my head or a link in the video description. Now, if you want to keep studying fantasy genres, I've included links to 3 great websites that will help you explore more subgenres of fantasy, and you'll want to give those a look, as well as check them out for some awesome book recommendations too. This video is just a starting point for the fantasy genre, but if you're a fantasy author and you want to take your knowledge to the next level and make your fantasy stand out in today's crowded marketplace, I highly recommend Calytics by Alex Neas, which is a data and analytics service that helps you position your book in the best genre so that readers can find it. Alex publishes industry reports and market snapshots so that you can optimize your book for the best possible visibility with readers. I purchased the Science Fiction and Fantasy Report a while back, and it helped me understand how to position my space opera series, Galaxy Mavericks, which to date has been my best-selling science fiction series. Calytics is not sponsoring this video. They don't even know I'm doing this, but I like the service so much that I wanted to pass it along to you guys. An affiliate link is in the comments. If you guys want more videos like this one, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. But the key is to hit that little bell, because every week when I launch a video, you won't get notified that I have a new video unless you click that little bell. And let's face it, that would be sad, right? So be sure to subscribe and you'll get videos from me every week. And don't forget to check the video description for links to all the resources I mentioned in this video. So I hope that you guys are having a fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you in the next video.